Well, welcome once again to the Curiosities podcast or Curiosities International, because this is a new side of the Curiosities podcast. We are doing it in a foreign language, at least foreign for Hèléne and myself. And we have a guest, which will introduce himself in a while, Cornelius Pietzner. And I'm Erland Kornfeld, and we are broadcasting from Järna, Sweden. And I used to work as a teacher in the curative education, and I've been a CEO for some schools and other institutions. And as a starter, before the others introduce themselves, we always tell that whatever is being said in this three-quarter of an hour, each of us self are responsible for all the content. And we are very anxious and grateful if you want to make a feedback at the curiosities@gmail.com or commenting on YouTube or where you listen to it on the podcast channels. So that being said, Hèléne, do you want to say something about yourself?
Well, I am Hèléne Blomqvist, and I work in curative education and social therapy, and also within anthroposophical trainings of different kinds. I sing and I make poetry. That's me.
Thank you. And Cornelius, who are you?
Well, thank you. My name is Cornelius Pietzner. First of all, thanks for inviting me. I'm honored to be here on your podcast and look forward to our conversation and to see what evolves. Well, I was born in Northern Ireland, grew up in the United States. I've been living in Europe for the last 20 years or so, mainly in Switzerland. I worked at the Goetheanum in Dornach for almost 10 years. I was on the executive council there and responsible for the finances. And since that time, I've been independent and been working in social impact investing, mainly in private equity and socially responsible companies. Also working for the Mind and Life Europe organization, an NGO that was founded by the Dalai Lama some 30 years ago, both on the board and also as managing director. And I stopped that about a year and a half ago. And now I'm engaged in a variety of different projects that I find worthwhile and interesting.
Great. And according to the hair color, we are all by now very wise, I suppose.
That's saying it optimistically. Right.
And, I think the themes for today is one thing that you are engaged in here in Sweden, doing a big conference in the spring. And you have a background in Camp Hill and have been dealing a lot with that through your personal history, but even in your work life. So that might be a topic as well with Camp Hill and Karl König. Sure. And I don't know, perhaps we start off with a spring. It's always a nice theme.
The spring in regard to our conference.
Yeah.
Sure.
Or other.
No, I would be happy to. Can I say a few words about that? Well, first of all, and this is a little bit of a pitch perhaps, but I'm really happy to be able to share this. We're doing a kind of a joint venture, if you like, between the Karl König Institute, which is based in Berlin. I serve on the board of directors there, and the Kulturhuset from the 13th to the 16th of April of this year. And it's an event, a conference that we're calling Inner Connections, Soul Breathing, and Nature Breathing. And this arose a couple of years ago, actually, out of some discussions that we had when I happened to be visiting here in Sweden, when we were discussing the work of the Karl König Institute, and particularly the drawings that Dr. König had done. He was a refugee. I can explain a little bit more later. He was a refugee who found himself in Scotland at the tail end of the Second World War. And as was the practice of the time, he was interned on the Isle of Man with a number of other so-called enemy aliens. These were Jewish refugees. And they had the opportunity there to basically have a kind of an anthroposophical study year. together with Willi Sucher, and the calendar of the soul from Rudolf Steiner was the main source of their study. And during that time, he made these drawings, 52 drawings plus 13 drawings related to each verse of the calendar of the soul. And this element of the kind of the rhythmic year and looking at the breathing of the soul through the year and its relationship to the cosmos seemed to me, in discussion, in this case with Anders Kumlander, to have a relevance to the increasing stress that we're experiencing with nature and the nature catastrophes, one after the other, one worse than the other. And to see whether we could try to address or try to speak to this inner relationship of the human soul and in the flow of time and the rhythmic element in the flow of time and nature as a living being through an event, and not focus particularly on the CO2 emissions and carbon footprints and 1.5 degree warming and these other things that are equally important but can be done in a sense better by other people and have been done. But really take another, shall we say, deeper look from a different perspective in regard to these elements that I've just mentioned. And through these discussions, we thought that this could be quite interesting and quite relevant and even urgent. And so we thought about this for a long time, and then came to the title of The Inner Connection, Soul Breathing and Nature Breathing. And decided that we would have this event at the Kulturhuset, as I said, as a joint project between the Karl König Institute and the Kulturhuset, and invite people to speak and to present and to share that we felt were doing worthwhile work.
Yeah.
Not only from the anthroposophical point of view, but also people in the larger community who shared similar values and were similarly engaged. And we've now put together a program, you can look at it on interconnections.org, that I think is very rich in its architecture, very full, and actually quite exciting with very interesting personalities, largely from Sweden.
Yeah.
But not only, it is also there's an international cast, if you like, of speakers. And we can speak more about this, but it will take place, as I said, in April at the Kulturhuset. Everyone is warmly welcome to attend. And I hope it's an inspiring and worthy and worthwhile contribution to this important issue.
Yeah, thanks.
So can you remember when and how you got this idea to connect the whole question about the environment and the climate with the soul calendar?
Yes, I can remember, because in the Karl König Institute, we've been very involved with the calendar of the soul. And Richard Steele, who is the managing director there, is also doing webcasts every week now to some 600 people all over the world, both in English and in German. So it's been an issue for us because we have these drawings, these original drawings from Dr. König that have been exhibited almost 30 times in various places in Europe. And we're bringing the exhibit here to Hèléne as well with these drawings, together with drawings from Thor Olsen, a Norwegian painter who also lived and worked in Hèléne. And so in discussion with Anders there, sitting in the Swedish countryside, in this incredibly powerful, wonderful nature, it was a kind of a natural inspiration to realize that with so much press, so much urgency, so much catastrophe, so much suffering, so much confusion in the world of nature, that we had an opportunity to try to offer something that would illuminate and explore the connection of us as human beings and our soul rhythms with the rhythms of nature. It was a kind of a natural inspiration, shall we say. And so, we've worked on that since then, and I hope we can do justice, and I think we will be able to do justice, that is to make some, even modest contribution to maybe shedding light from a different point of view on this complex subject.
Yeah. And perhaps we might say some more. I think we all three of us have experiences, personal experiences with working with a soul calendar. Sort of go a bit deeper into what it is. As you mentioned, those are 52 verses, one for every week. But how could you describe the content?
I can read one for this week.
Yeah. Please do.
You can go out from there. This is for the week that starts with the 12th of January.
Excuse me, will you read this in Swedish?
No.
If you like, but I can also read it in English.
Let's hear it also in Swedish.
Yeah, okay,
it's not so long.
Sure. Absolutely.
Let's start with English, I think.
I start with English and then I do the Swedish. So, soul's creative power strives from the heart to kindle godly forces, to work aright in human life, to shape its very self through human love and human deeds. And Sweden. Mitt inres skapar makt. Den strävar att ur hjärtats grund upptända gudakraft i människolivet till rätta gärningar och att sig själv gestalta i människokärlek och i människoverk. Yes.
For me, if you just listen to that, for example, for the first time, those are kind of mysterious words. You can go about it like a poem, but then the question would be, how would you sort of work or get closer to? Is it a matter of content, understanding the words, or how could you work with it?
Well, I think, everyone would find their way to work with it.
Yeah, for sure.
Certainly, I think you're absolutely right. If you first read it, or if you read it for the first time, you can think, what does this mean? How do I get an access to it? And, my own personal experience is that like a key principle of meditation itself is that, the principle of repetition is important. So it's something that grows over time. It has layers. And what that means practically for me is that, that one occupies oneself with it and reads it again and again and again, and then it slowly grows. It's like pictures that can form, or you have a bit of an insight, or something makes sense, and you realize that something is that you've understood is corresponding to something that you're feeling in your own inner life. And maybe I could just read something else that I've always found as a kind of a framework that's helpful for working with the calendar of the soul. And it's a little verse that Rudolf Steiner gave to Elisabeth Frede at the time of the calendar of the soul. And it kind of puts this, the whole architecture, and it's a very complex architecture of the calendar of the soul, because it's not just the single verses. The verses themselves always have a corresponding verse for the opposite time of the year.
And she was a board member in the original board of the Anthroposophical Society, which were founded at the Christmas meeting.
Exactly. Thank you. I can just read this in English. It's very simple. And again, it's something that one can just internalize by repeating it again and again. And Rudolf Steiner gave this to her, and basically it goes as follows. Knowing oneself, self becomes world. Knowing the world becomes self. And you think, well, okay, that might be obvious, but it's in some ways, but at the same time it's not very obvious. But it's, to me, very relevant here, because insofar as we can penetrate into our own soul depths, and that those are layered depths. It's not like we have one clear look normally into our soul life. Then to the extent that we can do that, we also can have a relationship to the world. And I find that also very relevant for what we're doing with this conference. Right? And in this sense, it's the world of nature. So to the extent that we understand ourselves and the evolution of our, or development of our soul life through the course of the year, we also can understand the corresponding elements in nature. Yeah. So, please.
You write in the invitation that I read on the homepage that humankind is not only part of nature, it is akin to nature.
Yeah.
I found that sort of standing out.
Yeah.
What does this mean? Oh, not only part, but akin to nature.
Yeah. Well, let me just respond to that aspect from a slightly different point of view. Again, in my experience, for many, many people today, nature itself is a portal to the divine. It's a gateway to the divine, and in that sense, it's a gateway to oneself as well. And it's not for nothing that there's so many interesting initiatives and people who are exposing, if you like, or leading people into an experience of nature. Because in that experience, they experience the force of life that lives within themselves, the force of evolution that lives within themselves, the force of growth, the force of decay, the force of life and death that lives within ourselves. So, being akin to nature, we discover many elements that we experience and have within ourselves as human beings. So I think that's maybe one way, one layer, to understand that, and why we also wanted to put this wording in there that the human soul is akin to nature.
And I think before you mentioned two, for me, central concepts in out of anthroposophy, which sort of methodical sort of way of dealing with the soul calendar, and that would be repetition or continuity and meditation. So for me, that's one way of working with the soul calendar in a meditative way, which goes along with a continuity or repetition, and sort of for my personal experience, there is something growing, which isn't there at the start.
Right.
So you can't sort of really have an observation or information. It's something which is rather mystical, I think. How can it be that things grow out of a verse? But for me, that's an experience or a feeling that when you do it often, it ends up as something different as from the start.
But it's the same with poetry. I mean, it's the whole mystery or the life of the words, the texts that you read and sometimes read loud, because this is, of course, read often aloud in a circle of people as preparation for work or whatever. And it's also done artistically in eurythmy. So it's sort of, you can come into this material from so many different doors. And it's akin to poetry, I think, in that way. That the text is there, and then when you add your own consciousness and feeling, something new happens. And that we hope will happen in the conference, that we can sort of lift it out of the texts and come into conversation and this inner connection that you call the whole conference. I've been wondering about this. What does inner mean?
Well, I'm going to ask you. I'm going to ask you that question right back in a second. What does it mean to you? So I'll give you a moment to think about it. But maybe one other thing, and it relates to what you both said, both to poetry and to the methodology, Erland, that you mentioned. In some ways, when we approach a meditative verse or meditative content, for me, it's always a question of how do we quiet down our intellect, right? Mm-hmm. So that we don't attack it, if you like, with, purely with our intellectual capacity of thought, but try to shrink that a little bit or put it to the side so that something can grow. Mm. Because often with our intellect, we attack something or we understand something and then we already have a concept. Mm-hmm. And that concept is fixed then. So to keep this organic, to keep it living, to keep it having the capacity to grow and to expand, that element has to be put a little bit aside so that our feeling life and our thinking life can kind of merge in a interesting symbiosis that allows these insights, these feelings, I think was the word you said, to grow. And that's, I think, a difficult task today. And it's one of the first tasks of how do we not wish to immediately, from an intellectual point of view, understand something. And be willing to come again and again and again to something, even if we don't quite understand it, until all of a sudden we realize, oh, there's a little seed there, a quite unexpected element, and it's beginning to take on a form and beginning to develop and grow in ways that make a difference for us, and maybe then even inform our activity, our actions, our will.
And I think that's a beautiful picture, imagination with the seed, because the sort of intellectual or abstract view is like putting a lid on something. It prohibits the growth. So you really have to take it away and expose it to light, or then the seed can grow. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's a similar process with the soul calendar. And also it's a tuning in with the world around. So it's like a bridge from my inner life to the life in nature or the outer world. And it's helpful because it helps me to change. Often otherwise you go with a concept and you do it the same way every week for a year or many years. But this forces you sort of to be flexible or be in that mood to change and still tune in the outer world. And that's, I think it's a great experience. Mm.
To the question of what is inner, this is maybe one sliver of a response. If you look at us three, just by way of example, we have an outer connection. Erland, you're sitting there. Hèléne, you're sitting there. I'm sitting here. We have a wonderful table here. We have wonderful people behind the cameras, and there's a certain constellation. They're externalities. But we also have something that's non-visible, that is inner. We're building an inner connection through our conversation. And that may have an outer side to it through the words that we're exchanging and the physical elements. But it also has, shall we say, a soul element in the sense that we, through our conversation and through our turning towards each other and turning towards a subject, are building an element perhaps of warmth, of interest, of curiosity. These are actually supersensible phenomena, but they're real. And in that sense, one could say they're inner as well. And they have as much validity, but are often, we experience them. We know this. We have a certain kind of natural clairvoyance, I think, today, where we perceive this, the relationships that we have. But often we're not so schooled, maybe I can put it that way, in being able to articulate these inner connections and these inner relationships. But they also direct our actions then, ultimately. So maybe that's just a spontaneous and perhaps somewhat superficial example. But that inner connection that we build over time ultimately is as real, if not even more real or determinative than the externalities, right? Because we'll go apart at some point in a few, some minutes, but we may remember what happened between us as an inner connection. And I think many people experience that in small groups and in various endeavors that they do, that those inner connections are the ones that ultimately count. And perhaps in the conference that we want to that we're going to have in April, it's those elements that we would like to at least try and elucidate, try to point out, try to point towards, and maybe become aware of them and take it from there.
Yeah, and that's a beautiful connection to moving on to the Camp Hill.
Can I just say something in
Sure.
between? But then when I look at the program, just to lift up what's all in there, it's the speakers, the keynote speakers that come from, for instance, people who have been in the government in Sweden, like Isabella Lövin and Anders Wijkman, who, people who really have been working within the Swedish society and also internationally with all these questions of how to shape the future, thinking about the environment and the climate question. And added to that, you have the artistic workshops and also the gardening sort of workshops. So I just wanted to
Thank you.
Thank you also for that you have this possibility, because maybe it's through the arts that we can really connect with our feeling life to this whole question of who am I in relationship to climate and nature. What do you think?
No, I agree. I mean, we need different ways to digest information and material and our experiences, and the arts is in all its forms is such an important way to do that, and it's also an important path of cognition, the arts. I mean, it's one thing to take in intellectual content, it's another to come to these living insights through the arts. So to be able to have the complement of both of these elements, and not just with important and interesting individualities like Anders Wijkman and Isabella Lövin, but other activists and other people who are engaged in some of these externalities or external issues, that needs a process of working through. So we're grateful that we have the nature walks, that we have the singing, the eurythmy, the painting, the poetry, all of these things as ways to deepen our experience. Because in the end, it's my view and my experience that only when we can deepen the experience does it become something that we're willing to then do and deal with. If it stays superficial, even if we're momentarily inspired, we get inspired by a lot of stuff in the course of one day, much less a week. It's boom, 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 boom in our information age. So if we can internalize it and really kind of work it through as much as we can over a weekend, then maybe new networks, new relationships, new initiatives, new inspirations, and certainly new insights could arise. That would be a best case scenario, for the event. So very glad that we have such a wonderful and rich complement of workshop leaders and presenters.
And I understand it's open for anyone who's interested in these questions. It's not to the anthroposophical networks, but it's really the whole society, internationally, or
even the anthroposophical networks are invited.
Okay, they can. Oh, okay.
I mean, in a way, these issues they're not the province of the anthroposophists, just like they're not the province of the climate activists. It's the province, it's the property, to use another word, of all of us as human beings. So, more and more, whether we use the same language or even the same concepts, I think many of us mean the same things, and some of these are quite spiritual and quite deep. So, I prefer not to separate and to say, here's the anthroposophical group and here's the other group or something like that. We're all in this boat together. And certainly the conference is intended, it's a public event, there's no question. And so we would love to have lots of young people there. We've certainly invited and have a number of volunteers from the Yippies program at Hèléne and many others. So yes, by all means, feel warmly invited to come.
Well, then I'll connect to another bridge in the Camp Hill, because that's a movement as well, which are not sort of just for anthroposophists. Although the first connection would be creating an inner space or a connection between people living in a Camp Hill village or institutions. And perhaps you could elaborate, say something about the Camp Hill movement. What is that?
Well, what you said we had a couple of hours? No. That's an important question, and I if you allow me, I would like to answer it in a particular way. And the way I would like to do it is to go actually back in history, because going back in history will allow us to look forward to our present time and into the future. Mm-hmm. I think what is important to understand with the founding of the Camp Hill movement in 1938, 1940, is that this was a group of, I would call them, unlikely compatriots. I mean, they were individuals from Vienna, Austria, and most of them, almost all of them, were Jewish, and so they had to flee with the Anschluss. And they had a study group in anthroposophy under the tutelage, under the leadership of Dr. Karl Koenig. He was an established pediatrician already. And these were young people, really quite young, who were art students and medical students and others, quite different kinds of people. And they forged these inner connections, a very strong bond with each other. And then they all had to flee into the world, and they took different paths, and they ended up, it's a long story made very, very short, they ended up in Scotland. And they were essentially given a property to rebuild their lives, and for them the commitment was to rebuild their lives with the refugees of the time. They themselves were refugees, I mean, physically, really refugees. But the people who were social refugees, the group that were social refugees, outcasts at the time, were people with special needs, people in need of special soul care. Back then, not that you can remember, even if we have white hair, but it was a very different climate.
Yeah, sure.
And so they wanted to build this life together based on a practical, applied anthroposophy in community of which they had no experience, and kind of build it as it went along, together with this other group of outcasts and refugees. And that's how Camp Hill began, and they had to discover things, along the way, but their commitment really was to try to embed every element of their, at that point, very simple and difficult life with anthroposophical insights. And out of that, slowly, this Camp Hill seed grew and grew and grew and expanded into many different countries and ultimately pretty much all over the world. But the reason why I mention this is that although we think of Camp Hill as a movement for social renewal, or a movement really focused on individuals in need of special soul care, actually, one could almost say it was a movement for outcasts, for refugees. And, if you look around today, we're in a world of commotion and movement and refugees and people who are outcasts. And so I think there are real opportunities for Camp Hill, I wouldn't say to reinvent itself, but to take hold of its history to move into the future, in that regard. So, in a more more conventional wording, one could say it's a movement of intentional communities. As I said, spread around the world, of different sizes, different locations, with slightly different constituencies. But ultimately, and at a deeper level, it wants to be a movement for social renewal, and I think that's needed as much today as it was ever before. So whether Camp Hill and its affiliates and offshoots are up to the task, that remains to be seen. Yeah, and I think this is the reason why you're asking this question. I have a long history with Camp Hill. My father was one of those individuals who had to flee Austria. In his case, not because he was Jewish. He was one of the few who was not, but he refused military service in the German army, and at that time that was a very serious a crime. So he also fled, and he was one of the co-founders of Camp Hill, and so I, by happenstance, was born into the Camp Hill movement. And
but not in Scotland.
In Northern Ireland. He was sent then to Northern Ireland to build up the work there in Glencraig, near Belfast, and that's where I was born, spent 4 years there, and then he moved further west to the United States, and there the work started, and I spent my childhood there, and it was a wonderful childhood, and I think I benefited greatly. And then when I left, I thought I would leave for good. I thought I'd paid my dues. As it turned out,
mistaken.
I was mistaken. That's right. I was mistaken. I ended up after university and a number of other things, and with quite different ideas about my future, as destiny would have it. Thank you, destiny. I ended up in Camp Hill in North America, and also founded a community, Camp Hill Sultane, which both of you have visited. Thank you for joining us back then. It was many years ago, for young adults, and was very involved with the development of the Camp Hill movement in North America for many years, and from which I also learned a great deal about many things.
Could you say something about the theme of living together, which seems to be sort of a problem in the anthroposophical movement in general? What is sort of the needs, or what you need to know, or what you need to do to,
or what you learn?
if you said it's even possible today to renew this core question of living together.
Yeah.
Today it might not have to do with people with special needs so much as immigrants, but I feel it's a little bit the same question, even in the way you began with talking about outcasts.
Yeah. Well, just maybe one or two things. I will say living together is pretty damn hard.
Yeah. But why?
But it's a wonderful thing. Because we confront ourselves all the time, and we experience our double all the time. We experience our lower selves again and again and again. And the incredibly wonderful thing, and I'm just speaking personally here, in the Camp Hill experience and working with people with special needs, is they are able to reflect that back in a way without judgment, and with an unending sympathy, reflecting myself back to me. So, I think this is a very complicated question, but I think, two things are, and they're related, two things are important. One is to realize that we will encounter our double, our lower selves again and again, and be willing to take that on. And that's perhaps the key, because what that implies is that we're willing to work on ourselves. And that's hard work. That's the hardest work. And it goes in small steps. Sometimes, you work hard and think you're getting better at something small, and then you realize, oh my gosh, I blew it again. But for me, that was the key. If you're also in Camp Hill, if you're going to survive, so to speak, over time, is the willingness to work on oneself. And to do that means being willing to look in corners that haven't been dusted, haven't been looked at, where the light maybe doesn't shine so brightly, and to be willing to take on board also the inputs of our fellow human beings, in that regard. For me, that's the big, that's probably the key thing, and everything follows, tolerance, gratitude, generosity of soul, generosity of spirit. If one sees these things in oneself, then one is probably willing to be a bit more generous, when one sees it in somebody else. So I know that's maybe, there are many other elements to that question. But I think for me, that's kind of coming to the core. Yeah. It's basically a path of spiritual self-development. Right.
And it's interesting because I think it's very clearly described by Rudolf Steiner in some tasks of the schooling path, where to cite Rudolf Steiner, he says, know thyself, which is the main theme in the anthroposophical movement, equals overcoming yourself. And if you want to start to practice that, you start with the insight that the things that you can do, or the things that you think yourself are very good, you have to know that you have to harmonize that, because that's just one part. So you can't expect everybody to do the same. It's rather a shortcoming, and you have to overcome that, which is for me sort of stepping over a border which sort of finishes off with the concept of myself. And that sort of is the same thing with the soul calendar and with the conference in spring, sort of taking that step, which, as you describe, it's not so easy. It sounds easy.
But I have a comment on it. I mean, you said it's maybe not with people that have different needs and the diagnoses, but it's the refugees. You said, I think that the question of what do you say in English, psykisk ohälsa, also psychological difficulties, psychiatric illness, like depression and so on. I mean, that's really in the society, in the forefront today.
Yeah.
And through that, it's in the workplaces, it's in the families. And how can we deal with those things today in this kind of stressful times?
I mean, these are not small questions, let's face it.
But I mean, this inner connection, schooling myself thing, how can you put that in relationship to this huge question?
I'm going to try to connect the two things here. And I think there are two levels of commitment that are required, because if you speak about this maxim of human being, know thou thyself, from Ephesus, that's in a sense a first step, because we can be overwhelmed by knowing ourselves, and we can fall into a big black hole when we begin to know ourselves. So that first level of commitment is once, or as we begin to know ourselves, what do we do about it? Do we have a commitment to do something about it? That is to work on ourselves. Yeah. That's the first level of commitment, and that's a big one, And then, of course, there's the whole question of what are the, what's the toolbox that we have? What are the elements that we can use that can help us? And there are many of those, and it would take too long to go into describing some of them, but we know, and we need tools to work on ourselves, I think. So that's the first level of commitment. And the second one, and I think, Hèléne, it comes a little bit, to your point. I had often wondered, and let me just give a quick image. I'd often wondered about this classic image from Parsifal, where Parsifal sees Amfortas, and he sees the wound, and he fails to ask the question. And the question, as we know, is, brother, what ails thee? Right? This is the question. It's sort of this. He has been asked not to ask too many questions by his mother. You remember? And
What does that mean? What ails thee?
okay,
In modern English.
it means what's wrong with you, brother? What's troubling you?
What's troubling?
Yeah. And because Amfortas has this gash, he has this wound that is not healing. Parsifal beholds this, and because he's been told by his mother not to ask too many questions because it's impolite, he doesn't do the natural thing, which is to say to Amfortas, what troubles you? What is bothering you? What's wrong with you? And I had puzzled about that for a long time. And this brings me to the second level of commitment, because at least in my view, if you come to the point where you ask that question, you have to be willing to deal with the answer, right? So, and that's the second level of commitment, because it's our connection to our fellow human being, right? And that has destiny and karmic consequences if you ask such a question, with people who are having psychiatric or all kinds of problems that we have today. If you put yourself forward, you ask the question, you engage, what is our responsibility then to that person? And that's not an easy question, to be willing to make that commitment. And it has real life consequences. So for me, the first level of commitment, the second level of commitment go along with these classic images. And I think if we're not prepared to at least make some step forward in regard to both of them, we shouldn't rather not know ourselves, not ask the question. Right?
They belong together.
They somehow belong together. So, these are things to ponder and to think about. And of course, they have to do with, what are our own possibilities in life? What are we able to do? What are we not able to do? But I think we have to think these things through somehow.
And I think that's a beautiful conclusion of this talk, because you have to sort of make yourself able to put that question, perhaps even to nature, the Parsifalian question, what ails thee?
Exactly.
Because if you do, you get sort of another view on perhaps what to do. So I think it's a positivistic way to put it.
Absolutely.
That sort of achieving those levels, but it's a main work or a long time work. You can't
exactly
think of it like something you can achieve this spring. So you just have to start. But the sooner you start, the sooner you will get somewhere.